The morning sun touched the curtains softly as the smell of coffee filled the little house on Maple Street. George woke up the same way he had for almost 60 years, turning his head slightly to see his wife Margaret still asleep beside him. Her gray hair lay gently across the pillow, and though time had carved deep lines across her face, to George, she was still the same girl he met long ago. He smiled quietly, careful not to wake her, and sat up to start another day. Their house was old but full of warmth. Every wall, every piece of furniture had a story. The small clock in the kitchen had ticked through their whole marriage, marking both their laughter and their silences. The photo frames on the shelves showed their life in pictures, their wedding day, their children as babies, family picnics, and Christmas mornings. It wasn't a big life by the world's standards, but it was theirs, built on small joys and quiet loyalty. George made breakfast just the way Margaret liked it. 2 slices of toast, a boiled egg, and tea with a touch of honey. He always joked that she was the only person he knew who could tell if he stirred the tea clockwise instead of counterclockwise. When she finally woke and came into the kitchen, wrapped in her worn blue robe, she smiled the same smile she had given him for decades. That smile was home to him. They sat together at the table talking about the weather, about the flowers in the yard, and about how their grandson had called last night. There wasn't anything exciting to talk about, but neither of them needed excitement. Just being together was enough. After breakfast, George went outside to water the garden, and Margaret watched him through the window. She liked to see the way he still took care of things, still moving with the same patience he had when he was younger. It had been like this for as long as anyone could remember. Their love wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, like the ticking of that old kitchen clock. They had met when they were barely adults. George had been helping his father fix fences at a local farm, and Margaret had come by to deliver homemade pies with her mother. She had dropped her basket and the apples had rolled across the grass. George helped her pick them up, and from that moment something gentle began between them. In the evenings after dinner, they would walk to the little park down the road. It wasn't far, but it gave them time to talk and remember. Sometimes they walked in silence, their hands brushing against each other's, their steps falling into rhythm. They didn't need many words anymore. 60 years together had taught them how to speak in glances and small smiles. Their neighbors often said that George and Margaret were what love was supposed to look like. They rarely argued, and when they did, it never lasted long. Margaret would shake her head and say, "There's no point going to bed angry when you might not wake up tomorrow." And George always agreed. It was a simple philosophy, but it kept their home peaceful. They had raised 2 children in that house, David and Anne. Both were grown now with families of their own, but they visited often. Sundays were always special because the house would fill with laughter again. Margaret would cook too much food, and George would sit proudly at the table telling old stories their grandchildren had already heard a dozen times. It didn't matter. Everyone laughed anyway. Sometimes after everyone had gone home, George would sit with Margaret on the porch. The sun would be setting, painting the sky orange and pink, and he would hold her hand without saying a word. Those were the moments he loved the most, when the world felt still and everything they had built seemed enough. But life wasn't always easy for them. They had gone through tough years, too. When George lost his job at the mill, Margaret worked nights at a diner to help keep things running. They had arguments about money and worried about bills, but they always faced problems together. George used to say, "We'll figure it out like we always do," and they always did. When their daughter moved to another state, Margaret cried for days. George didn't know what to say, so he just held her until she stopped. Later, when his brother passed away, it was Margaret who held him the same way. They had a way of holding each other through everything, the good, the bad, and all the quiet moments in between. As the years passed, the world around them changed faster than they could keep up with. The small town got bigger, old stores closed, and new houses filled the fields they once walked through. George would sometimes say he didn't recognize his own street anymore. But inside their little house, nothing really changed. The wallpaper had faded. The furniture was older, but the feeling of home stayed the same. Evenings were always slow and calm. George liked to read the newspaper, and Margaret would knit or listen to the radio. Sometimes she would hum an old song, one she used to sing when the children were young. Her voice was softer now, but to George it was still beautiful. He would look up from his paper, smile at her, and say, "Still my favorite song." They shared everything, even their small habits. George would leave his glasses on the counter every night, and Margaret would move them to the shelf before bed. Every morning he'd ask where they were, pretending to forget, and she'd roll her eyes and say, "You're hopeless, George." It was their routine, one that never got old. When winter came, they would sit by the fireplace with a blanket around them. George would make hot cocoa and they would talk about old memories. Margaret loved telling the story of how George proposed, nervous, fumbling with the ring, dropping it in the snow. He had spent 15 minutes looking for it while she laughed until her stomach hurt. Every time she told the story, he blushed a little, and she never got tired of teasing him about it. Their love was simple but deep, built on decades of shared life. They had faced sickness, loss, and growing old together. They had learned patience, forgiveness, and how to find joy in ordinary days. Every wrinkle on their faces was a map of their years together. As Margaret grew older, her health began to weaken. She moved slower, got tired more easily, and sometimes forgot small things. George noticed but never made her feel embarrassed. He just helped her quietly, pretending not to see when she forgot a word or misplaced her knitting needles. He loved her in every way, even when time started taking pieces of her away. Some mornings she would sit by the window, staring outside as if lost in thought. George would ask her what she was thinking, and she would just smile and say, "Oh, nothing much." Just remembering. He didn't ask more. He knew some memories were hers alone. Despite the changes, their days continued with gentle rhythm. They still laughed at the same old jokes, still argued about who made better tea, and still said goodnight with a kiss. George often thought about how lucky he was. Not everyone got to grow old with the person they loved. He sometimes wondered what life would be like if he had never met her. The thought scared him. He couldn't imagine a world without Margaret in it. She was his beginning and his end, the reason he woke up smiling and went to bed grateful. On quiet nights, when the house was dark and only the sound of the clock filled the room, George would lie awake thinking about their life. He knew they had more years behind them than ahead, and that made him hold her hand a little tighter in his sleep. He didn't know that change was already creeping toward them. For now, life was peaceful, wrapped in the comfort of routine and shared love. But somewhere beneath that calm surface, a secret lay waiting, one that Margaret had kept buried for decades. A truth she had carried quietly, never finding the courage to tell him. George had no reason to suspect anything. To him, their story was whole and honest, every memory shining clear. He couldn't imagine that there was something he didn't know about the woman who had shared his life for 60 years. That evening, as they sat together watching the sunset through their window, Margaret rested her head on his shoulder. George smiled and whispered, "We've had a good life, haven't we?" She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with something he didn't see. "Yes," she said softly, "a very good life." And though he didn't know it then, those words carried a hidden weight. They were the calm before the storm, the last stretch of peace before the truth would come to light. The days began to feel slower after the new year came. The winter air was colder than usual, and Margaret spent most of her time wrapped in her favorite blanket by the fireplace. George tried to keep things the same as always, but he could feel the difference in the air. There was a quiet heaviness that hadn't been there before. He noticed how she tired easily. Simple things like walking to the garden or folding laundry left her breathless. Sometimes she smiled and said she was just getting old, but George could tell it was more than that. He started helping her with everything, even when she said she didn't need it. He would hold her arm as she moved around the house and make sure her tea was never too hot. Taking care of her gave him a purpose. Their children visited often now. Anne called every night, and David came by on weekends with his wife and children. The house would come alive when they arrived, full of chatter and noise. But after everyone left, the silence felt deeper. George would clean up slowly, listening to the echo of laughter that still lingered in the air. Margaret didn't complain about her health, not once. She always said she didn't want to worry anyone. When George asked her to see a doctor, she said it was just part of growing old, and that she had lived a good, long life. He didn't argue with her. He knew she didn't like hospitals, and deep down he didn't want to face the truth either. He just wanted her there beside him, no matter how weak she became. On some evenings, she would sit near the window and stare out at the snow-covered street. George would ask what she was thinking, and she'd give the same answer every time, just remembering. He didn't push her for more, but he sometimes noticed her eyes fill with tears she tried to hide. It broke his heart to see her that way, but he stayed quiet, hoping his presence was enough. He kept himself busy with small things, fixing squeaky doors, polishing the old dining table, organizing the shed. But no matter what he did, his mind always drifted back to Margaret. He couldn't stop worrying about her. Every time she coughed or winced, his heart jumped. At night, he would lie awake listening to her breathing, counting each slow inhale and exhale. He had grown used to her beside him, and the thought of losing that scared him more than anything. Margaret began forgetting things. Small things at first, where she had placed her glasses, whether she had already eaten lunch or what day it was. George tried to make light of it, teasing her gently. "Looks like we're both getting forgetful," he'd say with a grin. She'd laugh, but sometimes he could see a flicker of worry in her eyes. One evening, while he was reading the newspaper, Margaret started mumbling softly to herself. George looked up and asked what she was saying, but she didn't seem to hear him. Her eyes were distant, as if she was somewhere else entirely. He walked over and touched her shoulder gently. She blinked, came back to herself, and smiled weakly. "Just thinking out loud," she said. He nodded, pretending to believe her, but the moment stayed in his mind. The next day, while cleaning her writing desk, he found old letters and photographs tucked away neatly in a small box. He didn't read them, but he smiled as he flipped through pictures from their younger days. Margaret holding the children when they were babies, family vacations, birthdays. Then he saw an envelope tucked at the bottom of the box. It was sealed and had something written on it in Margaret's familiar handwriting. The words made his heart skip a beat. "To be opened only after my death." George froze. He stared at the envelope for a long time, unsure what to do. A strange feeling came over him, and a mix of curiosity and fear. Why would she write something like that? They had always shared everything, or so he thought. He turned the envelope over in his hands, tempted to open it, but something stopped him. He placed it back in the box, closed the lid, and slid it into the drawer. He told himself it wasn't his place to read it yet. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the envelope, wondering what it could contain. He tried to tell himself it was probably something small, like a message for the children or a few personal thoughts. But another part of him felt uneasy. Margaret had always been open with him. She never kept secrets. So why this one? Over the next few days, he tried to forget about it, but he couldn't. Every time he passed the writing desk, he thought about that envelope sitting there quietly, holding something he wasn't meant to see. It began to haunt him in a quiet, nagging way. Meanwhile, Margaret's condition got worse. She moved slower and spent more time in bed. George brought her meals on a tray and made sure she took her medicine. Sometimes she smiled at him with gratitude. Sometimes she just stared at him with a look he couldn't quite read, a mix of love and sorrow. He would sit by her side, holding her hand, talking about ordinary things like the weather or the garden, anything to keep her mind light. One evening, as they were sitting together, Margaret looked at him and said softly, "You've been good to me, George. Better than I deserve." He frowned and took her hand. "Don't say that. You deserve everything I've ever given you and more." She smiled faintly. "Maybe, but still, thank you." There was something final in the way she said it, something that made George's chest tighten. He brushed it off, not wanting to think about what she really meant. The next morning, she was too weak to get out of bed. The doctor came to the house and told George that her body was just tired. There wasn't much to be done except keep her comfortable. George nodded quietly, his throat tight. He couldn't imagine a life without her. Yet he felt it drawing closer every day. As the days went by, Margaret drifted in and out of sleep. Sometimes she talked in her sleep, saying names George didn't recognize, whispering apologies to people who weren't there. Once she mentioned the name Robert. George didn't know anyone by that name, but he didn't ask her about it when she woke. He didn't want to upset her. Instead, he focused on keeping her comfortable. He played her favorite songs on the radio and read her old letters from their early years. Sometimes she laughed softly, remembering moments they had long forgotten. Other times she just listened quietly, her eyes distant again. On one of those quiet afternoons while she slept, George sat by the window watching the snow fall. He thought about their years together, all the holidays, the struggles, the laughter, the little things that made life beautiful. He felt proud of the life they had built, proud that they had stayed together through everything. But the memory of that letter still tugged at the back of his mind. He got up and walked to the writing desk again. His hand hesitated on the drawer handle. He almost opened it but stopped himself. He felt ashamed for even thinking about it. Margaret was still alive, and reading her letter now would feel like breaking a promise. He sighed deeply, closed the drawer again, and went back to sit by her bed. That night, as he tucked the blanket around her, Margaret opened her eyes and looked at him for a long moment. "You've always been patient with me," she said softly. George smiled. "Well, I had to be. You never made things easy," she chuckled weakly. "That's true." Then she reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. "Promise me something, George." He leaned closer. "Anything." "When I'm gone," she whispered, "remember the good years. Don't dwell on the bad ones." He felt his throat close up. "You're not going anywhere," he said quickly, forcing a smile. But she just looked at him sadly, as if she already knew. Later that night, after she fell asleep, George sat by her side, holding her hand until his eyes grew heavy. The sound of her breathing was slow and uneven, and he prayed silently that she would wake up strong the next morning. He didn't know how much time they had left, but he wanted to make every day count. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the world in white silence. Inside, George kept watch over the woman who had been his whole world for 60 years, unaware that the letter waiting in the drawer would soon change everything he thought he knew about her. The days turned quiet in the Thompson house. Winter began to fade, and the snow outside started to melt, leaving small puddles along the road. The trees were bare and the air was cold, but George still opened the curtains every morning to let the light in. He wanted the room to feel warm for Margaret, even if the world outside wasn't. Margaret had grown weaker. She spent most of her time resting now, her hands folded gently on her lap or holding a cup of tea that often went cold before she finished it. George stayed close to her, never leaving the house unless it was absolutely necessary. He didn't want her to wake up and find herself alone. The doctor came once a week. Each time he spoke gently, saying the same thing, that she needed rest, that her heart was tired. George nodded politely, though he hated hearing those words. He wanted someone to tell him she would get better. But no one ever did. At night, George sat beside her bed reading the newspaper aloud, even when she was too sleepy to listen. Sometimes he would stop and ask if she was comfortable. She'd smile faintly and say, "I'm fine, dear." Those words always broke him a little because he knew she wasn't fine. Not really. One afternoon, while she was sleeping, George sat quietly in the living room. The house was still, and his thoughts drifted back to the letter in the drawer. He had almost forgotten about it these past few weeks, but now the thought came rushing back. He looked toward the desk. The envelope was still there, untouched. It seemed to wait for him like a secret whispering through the quiet. He stood up slowly and walked to the desk. He opened the drawer and pulled out the small box where he had placed it. The envelope was still sealed, the handwriting neat and calm. "To be opened only after my death." He read the words again and felt his stomach twist. Why would she write something like that? They had shared everything for 60 years. What could possibly be left unsaid? He ran his fingers along the edge of the paper, tempted to tear it open. For a moment he almost did. But then he thought of Margaret asleep in the next room. He felt a wave of guilt wash over him. She was still alive, and reading it now would be breaking a promise, even if it was one she never spoke aloud. With a sigh, he put the letter back, closed the drawer, and returned to her side. That evening, when she woke up, she looked at him quietly for a long moment. "You've been pacing again," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "I'm just restless, that's all. Not used to sitting still so much." She reached out and touched his hand. "You've always had a restless heart. But you stayed all these years. You stayed." "Of course I stayed," he said. "Where else would I go?" She gave a small, tired smile. "You're a good man, George." He didn't know what to say. Compliments from her always caught him off guard, even after all these years. He just squeezed her hand gently and said, "And you're the reason I am." In the following days, Margaret grew quieter. Sometimes she drifted in and out of sleep, mumbling things George couldn't make out. Once she whispered a name again, the same one she had said before, Robert. Her voice was so soft he almost thought he imagined it. He asked her once who Robert was, but she just looked at him blankly and changed the subject. George tried not to think about it, but the name stuck in his mind. He didn't know any Robert. He wondered if maybe it was someone from her childhood, or a relative she hadn't mentioned in years. He didn't want to believe it could mean something else. One morning, as he was cleaning the kitchen, he found an old photo tucked between two books on the counter. It was a picture of Margaret from her younger days, standing beside a man he didn't recognize. They were smiling, their arms around each other like old friends. On the back of the photo, written in faded ink, were the words, "Summer 1964, with R." George stared at it for a long time. His heart pounded in his chest. Could this be the Robert she had mentioned? He didn't want to believe it. He told himself it must have been an old family friend, nothing more. Still, he felt something uneasy stirring inside him. He placed the photo back where he found it and tried to forget it. Later that day, Anne came by to visit. She brought groceries and helped clean the house. George was grateful for the company, but he didn't tell her about the letter or the photo. He didn't want to worry her. He didn't even know what to think himself. That night, Margaret was restless. She tossed and turned, whispering in her sleep. George leaned over and brushed her hair away from her face. Her skin was pale and her breathing was shallow. He held her hand gently and whispered, "I'm here, love. It's all right." Her eyes fluttered open for a moment and she looked at him as if trying to say something. "George," she whispered weakly, "promise me you'll read the letter." He froze. "What letter?" he asked, even though he already knew. "The one in the desk," she said. "When it's time, you'll know." He felt a lump in his throat. "I don't want to think about that," she smiled faintly. "You have to. There's something I should have told you long ago." "But I couldn't. I didn't want to hurt you." Tears filled his eyes. "Margaret, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. We've had a good life. That's all that counts." She shook her head weakly. "You'll understand one day." And with that, her eyes closed again. George sat there in silence, his heart heavy with confusion and fear. What could she mean? What could be so important that she needed to write it down instead of telling him herself? The next few days were hard. Margaret barely ate, and her strength faded quickly. The doctor visited again and told George that the end was near. George nodded, though his hands were shaking. He spent every moment by her side, talking to her even when she couldn't answer. He wanted her to know she wasn't alone. Sometimes he thought about asking her again about the letter, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He didn't want to upset her in her final days. Instead, he focused on making her comfortable, on reminding her how much he loved her. One night, the wind outside was howling, and the house creaked with the cold. Margaret was half asleep, her breathing shallow. George sat beside her, holding her hand, watching her chest rise and fall. Every breath felt precious. She opened her eyes one last time and whispered, "George, remember what I said." He nodded, unable to speak. "I promise." She smiled softly, her lips barely moving. "Thank you. For everything." Then she closed her eyes and her hand went still in his. The room fell silent. George sat frozen, staring at her, unable to accept what had just happened. For a long time, he didn't move. The clock ticked softly in the background, marking the end of 60 years together. When the doctor came the next morning, he spoke gently, but George barely heard him. Everything felt distant, as if the world had gone quiet. He moved through the house like a shadow, doing what needed to be done, calling the children, making arrangements, receiving condolences. But his heart was numb. That evening, after everyone had gone home, George sat alone in the living room. The house felt painfully empty without her. He looked around at the things she had touched, the little pieces of her that filled every corner, her knitting basket, her teacup, her favorite book. Everywhere he looked, he saw her, then his eyes fell on the writing desk. For a long moment, he just stared at it. The letter was still there, waiting for him. His promise echoed in his mind. "You'll read the letter." With trembling hands, he walked over to the desk, opened the drawer, and took out the envelope. The paper felt heavy in his hand, as if it carried more than just words. He sat down, turned on the lamp, and stared at it under the light. He hesitated one last time, his heart pounding. Then slowly, he tore it open. Inside was a folded piece of paper neatly written in Margaret's handwriting. The first words made his breath catch. "My dearest George." His eyes blurred with tears as he began to read, unaware that the truth inside that letter would change the way he saw his entire life with her. It would break his heart, but it would also show him the depth of a love that had lasted a lifetime. Even with its secrets, George sat at the old wooden desk. The one Margaret used to write letters on, the one that still smelled faintly of her perfume. The letter trembled in his hands as he unfolded it carefully, afraid that even a small tear might erase her handwriting. His heart beat hard in his chest. He wasn't sure he was ready to know what it said, but he couldn't wait any longer. He had made a promise. He took a deep breath and began to read. "My dearest George," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone. Please don't be angry that I didn't tell you this before. I was afraid. Afraid to lose you. Afraid to see disappointment in your eyes. I loved you too much to risk that." George blinked, already feeling his throat tighten. He read on slowly, his eyes moving over every word as though each one carried a piece of her voice. "When we were young in the first year of our marriage, I made a mistake. I was lonely and confused, and I thought you didn't love me the way I loved you. You were working long hours, always tired, and I felt forgotten. During that time, I grew close to someone else, your friend, Robert." George stopped reading for a moment. The name hit him like a blow. Robert, the man in the photo. The man she had whispered about in her sleep. He stared at the paper, his hands shaking. For a long moment, he couldn't continue. His mind raced, his heart heavy with disbelief. When he finally forced himself to read again, the words blurred through his tears. "It was one night, George. Only one. And it filled me with shame from the moment it happened. I knew instantly that it was wrong. I never saw him again after that night. But soon after, I found out I was expecting our first child. I told myself it was yours, and in my heart I wanted to believe that. But I could never be sure. I carried that guilt with me every day since." George's breath caught. His hands trembled as the truth sank in. David, their son. Was she saying he might not be his? He leaned back in the chair, his mind spinning. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too heavy. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had loved for 60 years, had kept this from him all along. He dropped the letter onto the desk and covered his face with his hands. His heart ached in a way he had never known before. Anger, sadness, disbelief, they all came crashing together inside him. He wanted to yell, to cry, to run away from the house filled with her memory. But there was nowhere to go. After a few minutes, he picked up the letter again, forcing himself to keep reading. "George, please don't think that our life together was a lie. Everything after that moment was real. Every smile, every touch, every day we spent together, all of it came from love. I never stopped loving you. I tried to tell you so many times, but I couldn't find the courage. I didn't want to ruin the life we built. You gave me 60 years of love I didn't deserve. You were a good husband, a kind father, and the best friend I ever had. Please forgive me." The letter ended there. No signature, no goodbye, just that final plea for forgiveness. George sat motionless, staring at the paper. He felt hollow, as if something inside him had broken quietly and couldn't be fixed. The room was silent except for the ticking of the old clock. That same clock had marked every moment of their lives together, their laughter, their arguments, their quiet evenings. Now it ticked like a cruel reminder that life was still moving forward, even when he wasn't ready. He stood up slowly and walked around the room. Everywhere he looked, he saw her. The photo on the wall of their wedding day, the blanket she used to wrap around her shoulders, the teacup on the table. He remembered her smile, her gentle voice, the way she always touched his arm when she spoke. The love they shared felt real. It was real. But now everything felt uncertain. He went to the window and looked outside. The garden was still covered in frost, quiet and still. The same garden they had tended together for years. He remembered her laughter when they planted roses, her delight when the first blooms appeared. His heart ached for her, even through the hurt. He whispered to himself, "Why didn't you tell me?" There was no answer, only the faint sound of wind brushing against the window pane. That night, George couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the letter resting on the nightstand beside him. He thought about their son, David. Should he tell him the truth? Should he let him know what Margaret had confessed? But then another thought came. What good would it do? David had always loved him as a father. They had shared a lifetime of memories. Would knowing the truth change that? Would it break something that didn't need breaking? As dawn began to light the sky, George made his decision. He folded the letter carefully, placed it back in its envelope, and locked it inside a small box. The secret would stay there with Margaret's memory. Whatever had happened in the past didn't change the life they had built or the love they had shared. He couldn't let one mistake erase 60 years of devotion. In the morning, Anne came to check on him. She noticed the tired look on his face and asked if he was all right. George forced a small smile and said he was just missing her mother. Anne hugged him tightly, and for the first time in days he let himself cry. He didn't tell her why. After she left, George went outside to the garden. The air was cold but clean. He walked slowly along the path, touching the plants she had loved so much. The roses were bare, but he could still see the life beneath the stems. He smiled faintly, thinking how Margaret used to say, "Everything comes back to life in time." Maybe she was right. He sat on the old wooden bench, looking toward the horizon. The sun was rising, painting the sky in soft gold. For the first time since she passed, he felt a kind of peace. Yes, she had hurt him. Yes, she had kept something from him. But she had also given him a lifetime of love, and that counted for something. People made mistakes. He knew that better than anyone. Love, after all, was not about perfection. It was about forgiveness. He stayed outside for hours, lost in thought. The pain didn't fade, but it softened a little. He thought of Margaret not as the woman who had lied to him, but as the woman who had loved him enough to be afraid of losing him. Maybe she had carried her guilt because she cared. Maybe her silence was her way of protecting him from a truth that could have broken their family. That evening, George sat in the living room again, holding a photo album. Page after page, he saw their life unfold. The young couple on their wedding day, the proud parents with their newborns, the family gathered around the Christmas tree. Every smile, every memory, told him that their love had been real, even with its flaws. He whispered softly, "You made a mistake, Margaret. But you were still my everything." As night fell, George went to her grave for the first time since the funeral. He carried a small bunch of flowers from the garden, ones she had planted years ago. He knelt beside her headstone, brushing the dirt away from her name. The ground was cold beneath his knees, but he didn't care. He spoke softly, his voice trembling. "I read your letter. I won't lie, it hurt me. It hurt more than I thought anything could. But I forgive you. You gave me a life I wouldn't trade for anything. We had 60 good years, and I'll hold on to that. That's what matters." The wind rustled through the trees as if carrying his words to her. For a moment he thought he could almost hear her voice again, that gentle tone calling his name the way she always did. He closed his eyes and smiled. When he returned home, the house felt different. Still empty, but not cold. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the stars appear one by one. The letter was back in the box now, tucked away, but he didn't feel haunted by it anymore. It was part of their story. A painful chapter, yes, but still part of the same book. George realized something as he sat there. Love wasn't perfect. It wasn't free from mistakes or secrets. It was about choosing to stay, to forgive, to keep loving even when the truth hurt. And he had done that. He had loved her until the end, and even now he still did. He looked up at the night sky and whispered, "We had a good life, didn't we, Maggie?" Somewhere in the quiet of that little house, he felt her answer, not in words, but in the warmth that filled his chest. It was the kind of love that didn't die, not even with goodbye. Days turned into weeks, and life began to settle into a quiet rhythm again. George still missed her every day, but the sharp pain in his chest had softened into something gentler, something like longing mixed with gratitude. The house was quieter than it had ever been, but he began to find comfort in the silence. He could still feel her presence in the soft creak of the floors, in the scent of her favorite soap, and in the small details she had left behind. She was gone, but not entirely. Every morning, George would sit at the kitchen table with his cup of tea, looking out the window at the garden. The days were getting longer now, the frost giving way to the first signs of spring. Tiny green shoots pushed through the soil, brave and fragile. Margaret had always said that the garden was a reminder that life renews itself. He believed her words now more than ever. Sometimes he would talk to her while tending to the plants. It wasn't madness. It was habit. After 60 years of sharing every thought, silence felt stranger than words. "The roses are coming back," he'd say softly. "You were right. They always do." And though no one answered, it felt like she was there, listening, smiling at him from somewhere beyond his sight. One afternoon, his daughter Anne came over with her children. The house filled with laughter for the first time in months. The kids ran through the halls, their footsteps echoing like music. George smiled watching them play. It reminded him of when his own children were young. when Margaret would sit on the floor building puzzles with them, her eyes full of love. Anne made lunch, humming a tune her mother used to sing. She moved around the kitchen just like Margaret did, carefully but with warmth. George watched her and felt a deep sense of peace. His family was still here, still growing. That was what Margaret had wanted, for life to go on. After they left, he went back to the garden. The air was warm, the sun soft on his face. He sat on the old bench and closed his eyes, listening to the birds. Memories drifted through his mind. Their wedding day, the laughter they shared, the small arguments that never lasted long. He thought of the letter again, the secret she had carried for so long. It no longer filled him with pain. Instead, he felt understanding. He realized something simple but powerful. Love is not about being perfect. It's about staying. It's about forgiving. It's about choosing each other again and again, even when the world changes. Margaret had made a mistake, yes, but she had also spent a lifetime making it right through her kindness, her loyalty, and her care. In the end, that was what mattered. That evening, George sat by the fireplace with an old photo album in his lap. He turned each page slowly, tracing his fingers over the images. Their first home, the children's birthdays, the trips they took to the seaside. In every picture, he could see how much they had loved each other. Even in the simple moments, hanging laundry, drinking tea together, there was happiness. He smiled to himself and whispered, "We did all right, didn't we?" The next morning, George decided to visit David. He hadn't seen his son in a while, and something in him said it was time. The drive was peaceful, the sky wide and blue. When he arrived, David was surprised but happy to see him. They sat on the porch, drinking coffee and talking about old times. George watched his son's face, the way he smiled, the way he spoke, and something inside him eased. Whatever truth lay hidden in the past didn't change the man David had become. He was kind, responsible, and full of love for his own family. That was what mattered. Blood didn't define a father. Love did. They spent the whole afternoon together, laughing over memories, talking about Margaret. David shared how much he missed her, how she had taught him to always put family first. Hearing that made George's chest tighten in a good way. Margaret might have carried a secret, but she had also built a legacy of love that lived on through their children. When George left that evening, David hugged him tightly. "I love you, Dad," he said. George smiled through misty eyes. "I love you too, son." On the drive home, he felt lighter than he had in months. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He thought about how Margaret used to love sunsets. She would always make him stop whatever he was doing just to watch them together. He smiled softly, whispering to the empty car, "You'd have liked this one." That night, George sat by the window looking out at the stars. He took the small box from the drawer and held it in his hands. Inside was the letter, the one that had once broken his heart. Now it felt different, like a part of their story that he had finally learned to live with. He, Opie.